Good day everyone! Isang mapagpalang araw sa ating lahat. Welcome to the online lecture of World History. We are now in the chapter 14, which tackles the West between the wars. And as part of our class, I will going to discuss to you the history of the Western countries between the wars. I am John Cedric Valdez from BS Ed Social Studies 3C, your discussant for today's topic. Welcome to our discussion in Chapter 14, The West Between the Wars. And these are the key events in the history of the Western countries in the West between the wars. Europe faced severe economic problems after the World War I, including inflation and the Great Depression. Dictatorial regimes began to spread into Italy, Germany, and across Eastern Europe. The uncertainties and disillusionment of the times were reflected in the art and literature of the 1920s and the 1930s. And this chapter were divided into 4 sections, which are Section 1, the futile search for stability, Section 2, the rise of dictatorial regimes, Section 3, Hitler and Nazi Germany, and Section 4, cultural and intellectual trends. The Great Depression. It is one of the remarkable situations during the war in the Western countries. During the Great Depression, many people had to resort to desperate measures to find food. After the World War I, Europe was faced with severe economic problems, and most devastating of all was the Great Depression that began at the end of 1929. This brought misery to millions of people. They are begging for food on the streets. People were homeless and moved around looking for work and shelter, and in their misery, they saw suicide as the only solution to this situation. So, sinasabi nga dito na noong 1929 ay ito nakaranas ang Europe ng isa sa pinakamatinding problema ay ang Great Depression, na kung saan maraming tao ang nagutom, nawalan ng trabaho at walang tirahan. So, ang naging sitwasyon ng mga tao ay palipat-lipat ng lugar at naghanap ng trabaho and shelter. And nakita nila na naging solusyon dito ay yung pagpapakamatay na lang. So, ito yung pinaka-remarkable or significant event na nang. One is the futile search for stability. So, peace and prosperity were short-lived after the World War I and the economic depression in 1929. It weakens the Western democracy. So, uneasy peace, uncertain security. The peace settlement at the end of World War I had tried to fulfill 19th century dreams of nationalism by creating new boundaries and new states. From the beginning, however, the settlement left nations unhappy. Border disputes poisoned relations in Eastern Europe for years. Many Germans vowed to revise the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So, the Treaty of Versailles was the most important of the peace treaties that brought during the World War I to an end. The treaty ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers. So, yon yung naging mahalaga ang role ng Treaty of Versailles during the futile search for stability. So, the weak League of Nations. So President Woodrow Wilson had realized that the peace settlement included unwise provision that could serve as new causes for conflict. He had placed many of his hope for the future in the League of Nations. This organization, however, was not very effective in maintaining the peace. So, President Woodrow Wilson led America through World War I and crafted the Versailles Treaty's 14 points. And this organization, however, ay hindi naging effective sa pag-maintain ng peace. And isa sa naging problema ng United States ay to join the League because most of the Americans did not wish to be involved in the European affairs. So, the US Senate, despite Wilson's wishes, refused to ratify or approve the Treaty of Versailles. That meant the United States could not be a member of the League of Nations, which automatically weakened the organization effectiveness. Next is the French demands. Between 1919 and 1924, the desire for security led the French government to demand strict enforcement of the Treaty of Versailles. This policy towards Germany began with the issue of reparation, which were the payments that the Germans were supposed to make for the damage they had done in the war. So in 1921, the Allied Reparation Commission determined that Germany owed 132 billion German marks for reparation, payable in annual installment of 2.5 billion marks. The new German Republic made its first payment in 1921. So, in the following year, however, the German government, faced with financial problems, announced that they were not able to pay it anymore. And France was outraged and sent troops to occupy the Ruhr Valley, Germany's chief industrial and mining center. France planned to collect reparation by operating and using the Ruhr mines and factories. Next is the inflation in Germany. The German government adopted a policy of passive resistance to French occupation. German workers went on strike and the government mainly paid their salaries by printing more paper money. So, sinasabi lang dito sa inflation in Germany that the printing of paper money ay mas lalo lang nakadagdag sa inflation na kung saan nangyari na at the end of the war. So, economic adversity led to political upheavals and both France and Germany began to seek a way out of disaster. In August 1924, an international commission produced a new plan for reparation. The DOS plan, named after the American banker who chaired the commission, first reduced reparation. It then coordinated Germany's annual payments with its ability to pay. DOS plan also granted an initial $200 million loan for German recovery. This loan soon opened the door to heavy American investment in Europe. A brief period of European prosperity followed, but it only lasted from 1924 to 1929. So, nagkaroon nga ng inflation sa Germany and isa sa naging solution ay ang DOS plan, na kung saan ang DOS plan ay nagbigay ng initial na $200 million loan para sa kanilang recovery. Pero hindi man ito nagtagal ng mahabang panahon, but it only lasted from 5 years, from 1924 to 1929. Another one is the Treaty of Locarno. With prosperity came a new European diplomacy. A spirit of cooperation was fostered by the foreign ministers of Germany and France, Gustav Stresemann and Aristide Briand. In 1925, they signed the Treaty of Locarno, which guaranteed Germany's new western borders with France and Belgium. So the Locarno Pact was viewed by many as the beginning of a new era of European peace. On the day after the pact was concluded, the headlines in New York Times read France and Germany ban war forever. The London Times declared peace at last. And upon joining the League of Nations of Germany in March 1926, the new spirit of cooperation grew stronger. And 2 years later, the Kellogg-Briand Pact brought even more hope. So dito, 63 nations signed to this pact and pledged to renounce war as an instrument of national policy. And the causes of depression. So, dalawa ang naging main factor sa pagsisimula ng sa Great Depression. So, number one important factor was the series of downturns in the economies of individual nations in the second half of the 1920s. And by the middle 1920s, for example, prices for farm products, especially wheat, were failing rapidly because of overproduction. So the second one was on the international financial crisis involving the US stock market. We have seen that much of the European prosperity between 1924 and 1929 was built on the United States bank loans to Germany. Germany needed the US loans to pay reparation to France and Great Britain. And this is the photo of the economic downturns led to labor unrest in many countries. And this is the responses to the depression. So the extent of the economic downturn after 1929 truly made this the Great Depression. Governments did not know how to deal with the crisis. They tried a traditional solution of cutting costs by lowering wages and raising protective tariffs, but it makes it worse. So one effect of the economic crisis was increased government activity in the economy. This occurred even in countries that, like the United States, had a strong laissez-faire tradition, a belief that the government should not interfere in the economy. And another effect was a renewed interest in Marxist doctrines. Marx's prediction that capitalism would destroy itself through overproduction seemed to be coming true. Communism thus became more popular, especially among workers and intellectuals. And these are the democratic states after the war. President Woodrow Wilson had claimed that the war had been fought to make the world safe for democracy. In 1919, his claim seemed justified. Most major European states and many minor ones had democratic governments. In a number of states, women could now vote. So, dito, male political leaders ay nagbigay ng reward sa mga kababaihan para sa kanilang contributions to the war by granting them the voting right. So, yun nga yung karapatan nila sa pagboto. So, exceptions were France, Italy, and Switzerland. Women gained the right to vote in 1944 in France, 1945 in Italy, and 1971 in Switzerland. In the 1920s, Europe seemed to be returning to the political trends of the pre-war era, parliamentary regimes, and growth of individual liberties. This was not, however, an easy process. 4 years of total war and 4 years of post-war turmoil made a return to normalcy difficult. So, Germany, it is one of the democratic states after the war. So, the Imperial Germany of William II had come to an end in 1918 with Germany's defeat in the war. A German democratic state known as Weimar Republic was then created. The Weimar Republic was plagued by problems. So, for one thing, the Republic had no outstanding political leaders. So, walang leader yung Weimar Republic. So, in 1925, Paul von Hindenburg, a World War I military hero, was then elected as president at the age of 77. So, siya yung namuno ng Weimar Republic during this time. So, Hindenburg was a traditional military man who did not fully endorse the republic he had been elected to serve. So, the Weimar Republic also faced serious economic problems. As we have seen, Germany experienced runaway inflation in 1922 and in 1923. With it came serious social problems. So, widows, teachers, civil servants, and others who live on fixed incomes all watch their monthly incomes become worthless or their life savings disappear. So, this losses increasingly push the middle class toward political parties that were hostile to the Republic. Sinasabi lang dito na sa Imperial Germany ay yung mga balo, yung mga teachers, and those civil servants ay nawalan ng life savings na tinatawag, na kung saan, yun nga, the Weimar Republic faced serious economic problems. So, yun yung naging dahilan kung bakit nawala ng incomes and the life savings of the teachers, the civil servants during this time. Another democratic states after the war is the France. After the defeat of Germany, France became the strongest power on the European continent. Its greatest need was to rebuild the areas that had been devastated in the war. So, nung natalo na ang Germany, ay sumunod naman yung France, na kung saan naging makapangyarihan ito during this time. And siya ang may kapangyarihan sa European continent. At ang una nitong ginawa ay ang isaayos ang mga nasira pagkatapos ng digmaan. So, the France also suffered from financial problems after the war. The economic instability it then suffered soon had political effects. During a 19-month period in 1932 and 1933, 6 different cabinets were formed as France faced political chaos. Finally, in June 1936, a coalition of leftist parties, communists, socialists, and radicals formed the Popular Front government. So, the Popular Front government started a program for workers that some have called the French New Deal. So, the French New Deal gave workers the right to collective bargaining, to negotiate with employers over wages an hour, a 40-hour work week in industry, a 2-week paid vacation, and minimum wage. So the Popular Front's policies, however, failed to solve the problems of the Depression. By 1938, the French had little confidence in their political system. So kahit pa nagkaroon ng tinatawag na Popular Front government and isa nga dito yung the French New Deal, ay hindi rin to naging successful in solving the Depression. Next is the Great Britain. During the war, Britain had lost many of the markets for its industrial products to the United States and Japan. Such industries as coal, steel, and textiles declined after the war, leading to a rise in unemployment. In 1921, 2 million Britons were out of work. Britain soon rebounded, however, and experienced limited prosperity from 1925 to 1929. So katulad ng naunang dalawang democratic states, tong pangatlo ay nagkaroon din ng problema sa economic and financial aspect. So nung nag-decline yung industrial products ng Britain, ay maraming nawalan ng trabaho, and almost 2 million Britons ay nawalan ng trabaho. So, by 1929, Britain faced the growing effects of the Great Depression. The Labour Party, which had become the largest party in Britain, failed to solve the nation's economic problems and fell from power in 1931. So, after nang nag-fail ng ito nga, hindi naging matagumpay itong Labour Party sa pag-solve ng economic problems, isa namang a new government led by conservatives claimed credit for bringing Britain out of the worst stages of the Depression. It did so by using the traditional policies of balanced budget and protective tariffs. So, political leaders in Britain largely ignored the new ideas of British economist John Maynard Keynes, who published his General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936. He condemned the old theory that in a free economy, depression should be left to resolve themselves without governmental interference. So, John Maynard Keynes argued that unemployment came not from overproduction, but from a decline in demand. So the government should finance such projects even if it had to engage in deficit spending or had to go into debt. So last democratic states after the war is the United States. So after the Germany, no Western nation was more affected by the Great Depression than the United States. By 1932, US industrial production had fallen almost 50% from its 1929 level. By 1933, there were more than 12 million unemployed. So, kanina sa Great Britain, ang mga nawalan ng trabaho lamang ay 2 million. Pero dito, mas malala during the United States na nagkaroon ng 12 million na nawalan ng trabaho. So, under the circumstances, the Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to win a landslide victory in the 1932 presidential election. A believer in free enterprise, Roosevelt realized that capitalism had to be reformed if it was to be saved. He pursued a policy of active government intervention in the economy known as the New Deal. So, yun nga, nagkaroon ng malawakang pagkawala ng milyong katao. So, nung nanalo si Franklin Roosevelt noong 1932 presidential election, so sinabi niya dito na that capitalism had to be reformed if it was able to be saved. So, ayun. So, dito nga, nagkaroon ng government intervention known as the New Deal. So, the New Deal provided reforms that perhaps prevented the social revolution in the United States. However, it did not solve the unemployment problems of the Great Depression. In 1938, American unemployment still stood at more than 10 million. Only World War II and the growth of weapons industry brought US workers back to the full employment. So hindi din nagtawag diyan na solve yung problema ng employment o ng New Deal na tinatawag. So ang naging na lesson lang ng 2 million. So, nagkaroon na lamang ng full employment nung during the World War II na kung saan yung weapon industries. Thank you for watching. This is just only the first part of this discussion. God bless and thank you.